Welcome to PwC's Tax Readiness Podcast Series. This podcast is an excerpt from PwC's Tax Readiness Webcast Series held on February 24th, 2021, Key Takeaways from PwC's 2021 Global Manufacturing Survey. The panelists included Sherry Graybo, PwC's International Tax Services Co-Leader, Alex Velashko, PwC's Value Chain Transformation Leader, John Livingstone, PwC's Global Industrial Manufacturing and Automotive Tax Leader, and Anil Khurana, PwC's Global Industrial Manufacturing and Automotive Leader. In this podcast, the four panelists discuss the highlights from PwC's 2021 Global Manufacturing Survey, including business trends and challenges, tax considerations, change in business models, digitizing the operating model, supply chain tightening, process automation, as well as key takeaways. Have a listen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sherry Graybo. I'm a partner in PwC's International Tax Services practice. Today, we're going to be talking about key takeaways from PwC's 2021 Global Manufacturing Survey. Let me kick things off by introducing my fellow partners who are joining me to speak on the webcast today. Alex Velashko is a fellow ITS partner of mine and our Value Chain Transformation Leader. We also have John Livingstone, who is our Global Industrial and Manufacturing Automotive Tax Leader. And certainly, last but not least, is Anil Khurana, who's our Global Industrial Manufacturing and Automotive Leader, and he is the author of the survey that we'll be talking about today. With that, let's talk about the agenda. The need for close collaboration between chief operating officers and chief tax officers has never been greater. Today, we're going to go through and highlight some key trends and observations from the manufacturing survey, and then overlay the areas that are of particular relevance in our view to the chief tax officer. These changes and trends that we're seeing in the survey, combined with changes forthcoming in global tax policy and regulatory change, all of these things just require continued focus and potentially rethinking of tax strategies. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Anil to give us some background on the survey.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this discussion today, and look forward to the chat about COOs and tax issues that we all are likely to see more and more of. Just as a brief background, about 6 months ago, as COVID began to, I think, last longer than we'd all expected, one of the things that we were discussing was, hey, manufacturing companies in general, whether those are industrial manufacturers, technology manufacturers and all, typically tend to be a little behind the curve in terms of technology and some of the changes that we perhaps anticipate the world to be speeding towards. So when COVID hit, I think clearly there was a question and we all saw the change. Manufacturers had to work remotely. So many of us are working remotely as we continue today as well. The plant workers, the supervisors and all had to go in, but with a fair number of precautions, and in many ways had to make investments in technology on the shop floor as well. So from that series of discussions and disruptions and changes that we were seeing, came the idea of actually conducting this survey. So this is the first of a 4-part survey that we'll do in the rest of the year. The focus is on the impact of COVID in the near term, but also longer term changes that we are likely to see because of various changes, whether those be supply chain disruption that we've seen the last 12 months and they continue, whether those be technology, whether those be workforce. Certainly geopolitics is not far from the focus at any point in time, given it's the global challenges we're seeing in that area. And then the intent is to continue this, but change the focus every quarter that we run the survey. So this time we ran the survey about 585 participants around the world. Their titles range from COO to head of operations to head of marketing and operations, depending on the company itself. We had a range of respondents from small, medium, large. So large companies are above 5 billion, medium are between 1 and 5, and then small were below 1 billion. So we had about one third each approximately. We focused our respondents in 5 countries primarily: the US, UK, Germany, Japan, and China. We may expand that in the next cycle to a couple of other countries as well to give a little broader flavor, but those are the 5 that we have in this survey. In terms of sectors, we looked at manufacturing companies in the 8 sectors you see on the screen. And these represent a B2B, so business to business, and business to consumer as well. And we asked them about a dozen questions. These are done by phone call, so not a online survey, because online surveys can be quite deceptive. So this was phone calls. We had a third party that could conduct these surveys. Pretty reliable results. We confirmed some of the respondents' inputs as we talked to many of our clients as well. So I'd say you feel pretty, confident their results are robust. There's always a question that when you have surveys, how do you actually make sure those surveys are reliable, right? So that's the background of the survey. We will do this in about 3 months in April or so. At that time, we'll likely change a couple of the questions to focus on themes. In fact, some of the things we'll ask you today might be inputs into the survey for next time as well. So just to tee off a few of the key findings. So one is we all, sitting at home, working from home for the last 12 months, have seen a change in our behavior. Every consumer has seen a change in the behavior. Every consumer, all of us, are also business people, right? So our business to consumer and our business to business lives have intertwined. So think about the behavior and how customers, consumers think about their demands. So what was B2C commerce is now becoming B2B commerce. I mean, the number of discussions I have with my clients, CEOs, chief marketing officer, head of sales, on the proportion of product they actually want to be able to sell online, not completely sell, but at least some degree, some range of elements, is increasing. It's gone from 2-3% to, hey, I want to actually be 50% online. This is for things like pumps and gears and other things that are not necessarily consumer products that are standard. But for consumer, of course, the number is even higher. So that's, I think, a key change that you see. Second, we also have the supply chain, in front of us, especially with regards to the medical supplies, now with the vaccine, but pretty much it's disrupted every supply chain in the world. And so today, the hot topic is semiconductor for the auto industry. There's other topics as well. So the supply chain topics have become front, left, and center. And in some ways, the risk premium on supply chains moved quite a bit high, right? So cost was the prime goal earlier. Now risk becomes a factor along with the supply chain cost criteria as well. Along with that, resilience and information and visibility became important as well. So everyone wants to have a FedEx-like service for their supply chains. Everyone wants to have an Amazon-like experience for their business, right? So those are the kind of things we are seeing happen for us. The third is on the manufacturing system side. I think as we all move from phone calls to video calls, and from video calls to pretty sophisticated video platforms, similar things have happened on the shop floor and in factories and supply chains as well. The investments in technology, whether those be MES systems on the shop floor, whether those be IoT-based data collection systems, whether those be cloud, cyber platforms that I think make it easier for us to do analysis and so on. The shift is dramatic, and that's one of the key investment areas that many of our manufacturing clients across the different sectors and across the different countries are seeing. We've also seen disruptions in the logistics. So the last elements of delivery, transportation, warehousing, trucking, shipping, all those elements of the logistics have become tougher. In the US, for example, when the auto industry shut down for 3 months, a lot of truckers went out of business. When truckers go out of business, guess what happens? The delivery gets delayed. So logistics have become a key challenge as well, and investments are going into that, again, for capacity, but also in terms of new capabilities like distribution, information, data analytics, online bills of lading, things like that. And then last but not the least, the label here says factory of the future. I'm an engineer, so I just want to make sure that as business professionals, we see what that means, right? The factory of the future essentially is, you have machines today that are, not necessarily connected. Think of a factory that is connected. All the machines are connected to each other and the data flows that actually you see on the factory floor now flows to your ERP systems as well, right? That's a factory of the future. It's automation, but connected by data and information that enables us to make decisions on the shop floor, in the supply chain, and even live decisions on other factors as well. And many of these topics have implications for tax as well, which is, I think, where John and Alex will take us through shortly, but R&D tax credits or capital allocations or tariffs. So let me pause there and pass it to John.
Yeah, thanks, Anil, and hello everybody. Thanks for joining. Sherry highlighted the opportunity that comes from tax directors that are able to engage with business operating executives around those priorities of the operating executives. And as Anil just mentioned, given COVID and the disruptions that COVID has caused, there is really an opportunity for tax directors to engage in a way that we really have not seen in any sort of real recent period. We went into COVID where perhaps we came from a bit of a static operating environment to certainly a more disruptive environment where how operating executives think about managing their businesses has evolved dramatically. And so there's real value when a tax director can engage with operating executives around those changes. We know, though, that those conversations between operating executives and tax executives don't always happen naturally. In most organizations, it can be challenging for a tax person sitting in a corporate finance function to engage and sort of build relationships with operating executives that are essential to collaborating around these issues. And we know that there are very few operating executives that are actually measured on after-tax results. And so, driving a tax result through an operating strategy is often a challenge. But where the tax executive is able to lean in and build those relationships and connections and sell the value that tax can bring to the equation, and often what we've seen is that will require some assistance from others in the C-suite, there are very good outcomes that result to the organization. So for instance, looking at some of the priorities that Anil outlined, several involve investments in new machinery and equipment. And what if the operating executive was aware that many of these investments would be immediately deductible for tax purposes, and that the after-tax cost of making those investments is actually less than they might think? That might allow them to stretch their capital spending budgets a bit and accelerate their ability to achieve these priorities. Similarly, Anil mentioned that there is a focus on supply chains given COVID and that disruption. And certainly as operating executives are focusing on those supply chains, one of the key issues that they will be managing in that process is cost to the organization. And one very significant cost is taxes to any supply chain. And it's very easy for an operating executive to give back cost outs that they might have achieved pre-tax if the after-tax impact of what they're doing is not considered. So a real opportunity for tax to engage on that issue as well. So the big takeaway from the survey is that there is a level of disruption around how operating executives are thinking about businesses today. And that's all happening at a time when we are going through some very significant global tax changes. And so it's a great opportunity for tax executives to engage. They have a lot to add to that discussion. And the survey results are really validating that issue.
Yeah, thank you. Those examples were really helpful. Anil, why don't we talk about what is your tax experience, or your experience with tax rather, being plugged into business decisions, and any best practices that you've seen?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I did want to say that long ago I did my PhD in operations from the University of Michigan, and one of the things that I worked on at that time was an optimal footprint and tax model. And the idea was where you locate factories, where you locate warehouses, where you locate product and distribution matters. And of course, the tax rates then, actually can be optimized. Of course, that is a very theoretical exercise. And, little did I know at that time, I was 30 when I did my PhD. And little did I know that the complexities of day-to-day dynamics of tax decisions are much more complicated. But the way I see it happening around me in my discussion with the operations executives and marketing executives is perhaps two examples. One is what I said earlier, the location of warehouses, the location of legal entities, is something that people are optimizing all the time and is a dynamic factor. Clearly, factories can't be moved, but warehouse is a little more flexible and legal entity is a little more flexible. The second one that I see is around some of the changing incentives in tax. So John talked about the capital investments required in, footprint changes or supply chain or smart factory and things like that. Clearly in the US, and same is true in many other countries, the R&D tax credits that go along with it are significant. I see them actively involved. So I think we actually have labels for them, but these are the two key examples that I see, and they deliver significant numbers in terms of benefits as well.
Great, thank you. And as we're getting polling results, it looks like we have a nice cross-section of companies with us today, pretty evenly distributed. So that's great. And that's probably a good segue into delving a little deeper now into our next slide and talking about some of the business disruption we're seeing.
Great. So thanks, Sherry. So why don't I take the group through some of the details as Sherry noted, and we'll try to identify some implications for the tax executives in the data. Let's focus on some of the more notable challenges that our respondents provided to us, with a focus on the short term. So these would be challenges that they identified that they see in the next 6 months. And as we're looking at the data, the number one challenge identified by manufacturing operating executives was the impact of competitive threats on the business. This impacted large and smaller companies alike, and it reflects the challenge that manufacturers continue to feel about their ability to meet customer demands, and the stress that I think these executives feel around customers turning to competitors if they are not able to meet those demands. For larger companies, which tend to have more complex global supply chains, the disruptions related to shutdowns around the world, uneven and unforeseen demand for certain products and certain raw materials. Anil mentioned semiconductors earlier. We've seen shortages for things like stainless steel and a host of other sort of issues that disrupted their supply chains, put these larger companies at risk of not being able to meet those customer demands. While it was a big issue for larger companies, it was even more meaningful for smaller companies. And the data suggests that. And that's largely because of the challenge that smaller companies had to deploy resources to overcome issues that they saw in delivering for their customers. So typically these companies have less access to capital, less ability to address issues that arise in their efforts to satisfy customer demand. So the next highest set of challenges that were identified in the survey was about employee health and safety. Again, it impacted smaller companies more than larger companies because I think they faced the challenges of having the resources necessary to make the investments necessary to protect their employees. Not a surprising result, and certainly something that we would expect to be a focus going forward for manufacturers. The next set of challenges that I wanted to highlight, and I think this is one of the more significant takeaways from the survey, is the very significant shift that these executives highlighted around customer demands for digital products, services, and interactions. And then also accompanying concerns around how these executives are managing risk to cyber attacks and cyber disruptions. We'll come back to this digitization acceleration dynamic throughout the course of the discussion, but this is really one of the more significant takeaways from the survey. And the cyber element of this issue is really a significant one. And we know from our colleagues at PwC who are in the cyber practice that the level of targeted intrusions in 2020 versus what we saw in 2019 was actually multiples higher in 2020. So we see this as an ongoing issue for our operating executives who've responded to the survey. And as Anil noted, I think earlier, we are seeing concerns around cyber as a bigger issue for our B2B clients or B2B respondents in the survey. And that's, I think, largely because their familiarity with digital interactions with customers and within their organizations not quite as mature as what the business to consumer folks have dealt with. And then finally, we do see a challenge that was highlighted around regulatory pressures. I think, again, we saw this more pronounced amongst our B2B respondents. And I think that reflects issues that they were dealing with around essential workplace characterization, mandated safety protocols, et cetera. So interesting results, in terms of short-term challenges. And, what we'd like to do then is focus on which of these challenges accentuated by COVID in the shorter term do these operating executives believe will become ongoing business issues over the longer term? And for these purposes, longer term is defined as the next year or two. So maybe the first thing to highlight is the challenge that had dropped the most when folks thought about long-term versus short-term challenges. And that was about concerns about employee health and jobs. I think this perhaps reflects confidence that our operating executives had in the vaccine rollouts that are anticipated, and perhaps meaningful reductions in COVID-related risks going forward. I think it also reflects some level of optimism that we've actually seen in other survey results that we've conducted around the ability of manufacturers to really take advantage of the economy reopening and the ability to really realize the benefits of a, hopefully robust economic environment throughout the rest of 2021. So an interesting data point there. Turning back to challenges, our operating executives noted that the risk of competitive threats, while down versus what they highlighted in the short term, is still the number one challenge that they identified in the survey. And I think this continues to highlight the concern that they have around their ability to meet customer demands and whether the pandemic has permanently redrawn the playing field with respect to their customers and end markets. It also, I think, highlights how our operating executives are going to be even more focused on trying to meet customer demand going forward. And the survey also highlights that this focus on digitization over the longer term is a trend that the operating executives believe is with us to stay. And so combining what our operating executives are hearing from customers plus the demand that they have to meet customer demands, we do think investment in these digital products, services, and interactions is really going to continue to increase here over the longer term. With that focus on digital, cyber risks, we still see as a significant challenge for our executives, not surprisingly. And while the concerns around employee safety are down, there's also an acknowledgement that employee demands for more robust protocols around safety issues will remain, as well as an increase that they expect around increased regulatory pressures. And perhaps this is focused on what we anticipate to be protocols around vaccinations on factory floors, employee safety more broadly, and maybe even, given all the discussion that we've seen around the costs that have been incurred by governments in responding to COVID, that we do expect corporate tax rates to increase over the next year and a half. So let's focus on the longer-term challenges identified by executives and some of the more notable industry-related observations. First and foremost, the highest response we received in the survey was the challenge to provide safe working environments to employees in the health industry. I guess not surprising. And the next highest risk was this risk that we've been talking about in terms of competitive threats in the industrial sector. And as noted, I think that has a lot to do with these concerns around stretched supply chains and the ability to meet customer demands. So Alex, though, I'd like to maybe turn to you and get your thoughts on this digital transformation dynamic that we see in the survey and have talked a little bit. And as executives are making investments in those technologies, how does that trend begin to impact operating models?
Sure, John. Maybe even before I talk about, specifically digital, just reflecting on the challenges and the disruption that you had just talked about. What a striking picture that paints, just from the, company's operations executive, and also certainly from the tax standpoint as well. We're really just looking at a situation where the company is under tremendous pressure, either because of the supply chain issues, because of the need to invest in technology and automation to keep up, because of the people-related, mobility issues, or just a change in the, offerings, both in terms of, more services, less products, digitally enabled offerings, or just customers want things priced differently. Just requires companies to just rethink their operating models. That, to me, that's really the biggest takeaway. Just the seismic shift in business environment and these challenges really means for most companies that the operating model they have, so thinking about the footprint, the entity structure, the transaction flows, the intercompany income allocation positions, are likely not fit for purpose anymore. So they're just, to me, just the overarching theme. And we're seeing a lot of focus, and we'll walk through some examples, how might you, react to some specific things. So just the overall observation. When it comes to this particular topic, John, the investments in digital innovation, digital marketing, sales, and digitizing products and services, these are great examples where we're dealing with entirely different value chains. When you think about just the overall economics and how companies make money, we're talking about shift away from purely product sales more into solutions with digitally enabled offerings. We're talking about just rethinking the way offerings are priced, more pricing on demand or success-based pricing that is enabled by data analytics and predictive technologies. And we're looking at also just digitizing the way we market and sell products, which causes companies to rethink their the channels and how they organize themselves, and certainly the tax footprint, as a result of that. Like, one great example of what we're dealing with is we're seeing more and more digitally enabled services. We're seeing a lot more scrutiny on existing operating models from a perspective of managing permanent establishment, taxable nexus, digital services taxes, what we're referring to as BAPS 2.0 very much targets that. So to me, these developments around digitizing sales, marketing, product services, and just overall rising digital expectations from customers really requires us to rethink existing structures, operating models, a lot of times rethink transaction flows and intercompany economics. So those are the hottest areas I see from the tax executive standpoint.
How is the uncertainty in policy affecting businesses from a tax perspective, John?
Yeah, no, great question, Sherry. So, I think it varies from company to company, to be sure. But there are many companies for whom the uncertainty is impacting them in a very significant way. I think from a tax policy perspective, we really are at an inflection point. Given COVID and expected government responses around the world, we're looking at a reversal of a trend that has really been going on for several decades now, and that is the sort of global reduction of corporate income taxes around the world. COVID is putting pressure on that trend. Government budgets are being impacted by the need to respond to COVID in various jurisdictions. There's also, I think, increased willingness politically to increase corporate rates to respond to those challenges. And then I think you're seeing with the OECD digital project in particular, a desire to even revisit the long-standing frameworks that have existed for taxing global businesses. So I really think we're entering a period here of a pretty significant transition. Now, in the U.S., of course, we had an election here recently, and that that election will have consequences, as they say. On the cost side of the equation, we are likely to see rates go up, and we're also likely to see some increased base broadening. I think on the incentive side, we may see some incentives for bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. President Biden has talked about that in his campaign and since he's been elected. And we're also likely to see some policy around providing incentives to companies to make certain investments in climate-friendly green technologies, which I know many manufacturers are focused on. So in addition to that, we still have some issues left over from the 2017 Tax Act, and specifically capitalization of R&D, the Section 174 issue. Which for many manufacturers that have very significant R&D budgets is a huge issue. Capitalizing those costs and the resulting income tax expense that results is a really big issue for them. We also have sort of the impending tightening of the ability of companies to deduct interest expense around the 163J issue. So as companies think about supply chain issues and tax rates and where they do business, investments in research and innovation, certainly we're entering an era where we want to promote that kind of activity, as well as capital structure issues. The uncertainty related to sort of the tax rules and how they apply to those issues are complicating the decisions that tax executives and business executives are making. No question.
Yeah, thanks, John. Certainly a lot of potential change still to grapple with. So with that, let's spend some time talking about changes in business models, and I'll kick it over to Anil and Alex for that.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things that we talked about earlier around innovation happening in both digital products and services. So I think, Alex, you described that in some detail earlier, as well as I think the investments that go into digital commerce. I mean, those are two things I want to highlight with regards to, I think, how our customer mix is expecting a different product, a different service. But then from how we sell those products and services also changing. So that means implications on what a solution is. How do you actually separate the physical from the lifetime of service that goes along with it? What's the difference between the value of data and information in this, for example? Those are some of the implications that we see aside from challenges, or not challenges, but benefits in terms of on time, real information, and how that value of data privacy and data ownership comes in as well. And those are a couple of things that I think some of the implications of digital products and services, as well as digital channels and digitization more broadly, create for us.
Yeah, and I think we see pretty much across industries, customers demanding more offerings at different pricing models, and faster, service just overall, and that really pressures companies to, respond and invest in particular types of capabilities. Maybe a few really quick examples to what does this mean from a perspective of a tax executive? Well, one is in the B2C space, almost 40% of your responders talked about pressure for greater use of digital channels, and we're certainly seeing that in consumer and market products as an example. Focus on omni-channel. This really triggers a whole evaluation of what is an appropriate transactional model to supply through that digital channel, e-commerce or omni-channel. With that, companies are closely looking at traditional, multi-tiered, distribution chains and structures, and really, finding that they're not really fit for purpose, either because of the, the indirect tax, the transactional complexity, or they just present a very complicated, convoluted set of business rules, for customers to engage. So the one trend I see in response to that is really focus on more, single sales entities, direct booking models of sort of remote selling into markets using more leaned out, streamlined transactional structures. So that's one example. The other example here, customers also in B2C space, demand, expect more involvement with product development. And we're seeing this across industries. The trend is really closer involvement by supply chains, whether it's sourcing professionals or supply chain planners or merchandisers with their suppliers. So certainly from a tax perspective, this means a few things. It means that, generally speaking, the economic significance of those activities in the supply chain of sourcing is higher than ever, because they're now not just placing orders and doing procurement, but they're actually engaging with suppliers in new and differentiated ways. So there's a lot of opportunity just to kind of evaluate value proposition and structure, a procurement, models, strategic sourcing, value-based services model. The other example here, when we're talking about expectation of greater transparency of product information, so, the trend of sort of environmental and social governance comes to mind. And again, just what we're seeing is really trickling through the system, another reason for companies to rethink their supplier base. And we already saw a lot of it in response to trade wars, and we're seeing it now because companies want to shorten their supply chain, for the reasons John, you had talked about. Here's another reason, ESG, environmental social governance is another reason why we're seeing companies either rethink their countries of origin or just rethink about how they're engaging with suppliers. So those are, to me, just, several examples of sort of the rapid change that is driven by expectations of, our customer base as to what we're delivering, how we're delivering, and how we're pricing those, services and capability.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I mentioned in the opening remarks was the significant investment going into manufacturing systems, the investments in cloud, IoT, automation, and manufacturing execution system. Much of this is driven by, I think, partly the remote working and all that we mentioned earlier, but also as we kind of figured out how to be more effective and efficient on the shop floor, some of that has actually meant a greater reliance on technology. So across the world, I think pretty much in every country that we polled or surveyed, the investments in automation more broadly, and in particular IoT, cloud, which is actually an enabler, but also robotic process automation, which is more of a, I'd say, a back office tool that enables repetitive processes to be routinized and hence automated through a combination of machine learning and all. I must say that I think as we looked at the numbers, the investment that Japan or the Japanese respondents suggested were actually a couple of notches above or ahead of the rest of the world as well. John, you want to comment on this from a tax perspective as well?
Yeah, no, I think I think this trend is certainly a catalyst for companies to consider changes to their model, and I think Alex has referenced that earlier. These tools are allowing companies to reassess where and how they deliver goods and services. And it also provides some flexibility as to where to locate and where these activities happen, and even to centralize them. Where in the past, we had a lot of intercompany services provided in country, this movement to digitization and centralizing certain of these services, we're seeing sort of a proliferation of these internal service hubs, these centers of excellence that companies are standing up, which are then in turn providing services intercompany on a cross-border basis. And as these tools allow for those services to, be a higher value service delivery to, within the organization, we are seeing some opportunities for companies to take advantage of this digitization trend around reducing costs, including tax costs, as well as some challenges that we're seeing in the payor jurisdictions around the ability to deduct those payments to these hubs. So we think that's a trend that, and an issue that we will see in the coming years. And where to locate these hubs and where to centralize these locations is a function of, we've talked about the R&D credit, we've talked about other incentives that companies are considering providing to locate these types of activities within their borders. This is the type of investment that countries are looking to attract. And so we do see around the world a real interest in these countries to provide the incentives to attract this type of investment within their jurisdictions. So an interesting opportunity for tax executives around this broader trend.
All right, Alex, let's chat a little bit about your observations, having worked with many clients on supply chain matters since the pandemic started about a year ago. What challenges have you been seeing when remapping a company's global footprint?
Yeah, it's interesting, Sherry. I think even before the pandemic, we already see this happening. First, because companies were kind of shifting from low-cost country approach to a best-cost country approach, just trying to find a way to think about the operating footprint in a more holistic way and just really chasing the lowest cost of production or labor. Then we had trade war, starting, and that caused companies to seriously think about, is that footprint optimal just from countries of origin or operating locations? And now, of course, all the, the supply chain challenges that, we're talking about here relating to pandemic, it's really become just really like multi-dimensional game of chess, from the supply chain perspective. The one thing I see is a lot of decisions to organize supply chain in a particular way are really, really difficult to change on any sort of short-term, quick basis. There's a lot of supply chains built around particular locations at a scale that is just unimaginable. And so, a lot of this talk, or publicity, or even just political discourse around, changing or motivating companies to change in the way they operate or how they organize their footprint. These are really challenging, really long lead time sort of endeavors. We're definitely seeing a lot of activity in this space. We're definitely seeing a lot of modeling, a lot of scenario planning. We're seeing some, short-term actions in response to particular, disruptions or challenges. But I think this is the trend. It's like turning an aircraft carrier. I think we're going to see this trend continue to be with us and causing a lot of sort of downstream impact on operating models.
Yeah, and it looks like based on the responses, just like the overall pace of business change is the biggest factor, maybe followed by the regulatory environment and ever-changing circumstances there as well. So with that, let's move on and we'll talk about the supply chain a little further. And I think John and Alex, you guys were going to lead that.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. And maybe if we can go off script just a little bit here, a little curveball to the team here. I got a question from one of our clients here, who's been listening to the discussion and focused on this issue of disruption in the supply chain. And Anil, maybe for you, his question is, what thoughts do we have around the historic approach, I guess, to this just-in-time inventory model versus reliance on sort of third-party suppliers that has developed over the last decade plus? And maybe that's the same thing, actually. But this notion of just-in-time versus, more investment in inventory, I think, is the crux of this question. I don't know if immediate reactions. And certainly, some of my opening comments around the ability of, larger companies with more resources to make certain investments to manage through these demand disruptions is, I think, part of the equation. But are you seeing sort of any sort of longer term, more structural reactions to that issue?
Yeah, I think, John, that's a really important trend we're seeing, and it's a great question because I think it's going to come in front of us next couple of years. So 2 or 3 themes in there. One is, I think, driven by, I'd say, the failure of very tight supply chains. Right, so tight supply chain means just in time, inventories are tight, global, connected, and so on. And that's failed because I think the disruptions from COVID certainly were a key factor, but even before that, the tariff, the geopolitics is actually beginning to play a role as well, along with the logistics chain being challenged. Now, think of it differently. The risk of cost optimization essentially went up. Just being cost optimal, which is partly what just-in-time enables, because you have low inventories, just went up. Redundancy is now being perceived as at least partially a good thing. But I think the challenge is redundancy, not at any cost, right? You've got to be really, thoughtful about where to put in the capacity for inventory or production capacity and so on. And then the last bit is that global supply chains, and this is something we see really actively since maybe last January, February, even as COVID were hitting, is global supply chains giving way to regional supply chains. So if you are sourcing from China or Vietnam and you're in the US, you are actually now thinking of Mexico as a key supply location, low cost, closer, and hence a better option than Vietnam and China, who might be 2 cents cheaper, but are going to cost you more in terms of resilience and the disruption that you might face.
John, if I may add to that, to what Neil said, and just on the topic of just-in-time, because I see a lot of this as well. We see a lot of, pressure on companies that want to obviously lighten up their balance sheets and, reduce the risk and the carrying cost of inventory, pushing on their supply base to adopt more of these, just-in-time or consignment inventory models. We've only seen it, but there's definitely a lot more of that going on. The one big challenge or obstacle I see to that is for companies to maintain that kind of a supply model requires not just very efficient supply chain, but investment in tools, technology, data, quality of data visibility that many companies don't have. So we're really seeing a bit of a rush to sort of upgrade those capabilities, and it costs money. And we're seeing larger companies being able to do it, and we're seeing a lot of smaller suppliers really struggling to invest in the kind of capabilities they need in order to supply just in time.
No, great. Appreciate those responses. So maybe just to pick up on the transition from Sherry before we made a little detour there. Let's talk a little bit, Alex, about supply chain as a value driver. I mean, I guess for most of my career, we thought about supply chains and how you price things within the supply chain as with a focus on where is the intangible property in the supply chain, and the higher the value of the IP, the more the income. The owner of that IP was entitled to the earnings, and the country that the IP resided in had the taxing rights to that income. But given COVID and that disruption, what do we see around the value of the supply chain itself? And is that something that, as we think a bit about these models, is changing how we think about value and pricing within the chain?
Yeah, John, the short answer is absolutely, indeed. We are seeing that. Just as a definitional matter, when we talk about supply chain, we're really talking about, a range of capabilities that, most companies have, starting with, ability to plan, demand and supply and balance it, to, manufacturing, sourcing of, components, raw materials, as well as logistics. So all those things, that is the system that we're referring to as supply chain. And you're absolutely right, John. Like traditionally, looking back, 10, 20, 30 years ago, these sort of supply chain, capabilities were not really thought of as of tremendous economic significance in the grand scheme of a value chain. A lot of focus was on IP planning, maybe a little bit on, risk taking and risk shifting, but supply chain was sort of considered as, more of a routine function. There was a lot of focus on it because, for example, support F rules or, sourcing rules kind of focused on that as an activity, but not as a huge, economic value driver. So fast forward to, the times that we're living in today, I would dare say, for most clients I'm working with, their supply chain is either one of or the critical success factor, and this is both because of its relevance, importance, and ability to supply, customer demand, but also supply chain capabilities have gotten a lot more sophisticated, just thinking about investment in technology and automation and data analytics and upskilling talent and just different ways of engaging with, supplier base and with the suppliers, right? All those things really just elevate, both economic significance on what we're calling supply chain in the overall, scheme of things, as well as obviously big, opportunities or consequences from tax perspective, right? Either as a matter of managing risk. An example of that would be companies making different make-buy decisions, and they decide to outsource production where they used to manufacture in-house, or they decide to change country of origin, and all of a sudden the historic tax structure that was geared around particular manufacturing model no longer works, right? Here's one example. And certainly opportunistically, we're seeing a range of things. One example is we're increasingly seeing such a thing as a supply chain intangible, an actual, set of capabilities, know-how, technology tools relating to supply chain, attracting sort of premium, economic value in the system. We're certainly seeing a lot more emphasis on strategic sourcing models, and sourcing as a high-value service, is another great example. As well as, Anil, you talked about Mexico and sort of the trends of nearshoring. That's another really interesting example. While what I said, companies don't really, they can't really quite quickly pivot their production, out of Asia, for example, onshore or nearshore, but a lot of companies have excess capacity in their own facilities or access to these, capacities just south of the border. So we have seen, manufacturing in at least, Western Hemisphere becoming, something that we're seeing, as a trend. And with that, there's a lot of obviously interesting opportunities as well from the, the tax either planning or just tax defense perspective. So those are just some of the things I see, John.
Thanks. And I know, guys, we want to get to the topic of process automation. So if we could shift quickly to Anil to talk about process automation.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sherry. So this is a question about priorities within the factory, within the production environment. And as you can see from so the question was, next 6 months and next couple of years, what are your top 5 priorities? So each respondent provided their input on that. Essentially, over time, the process, quality, real-time monitoring, engineering investments or priorities actually are increasing over time. But you also see, if you read between the lines, the implications are, yes, there's a lot of investment in automation that is being talked about here, but some of that is driven by the fact that workforce and norms, skills, as well as I think what we see today, remote working and flexible working are key drivers in there. So those are some of the key priorities that our respondents said. I do want to note that the bottom of the list, the 2 at the bottom of the list are actually both noteworthy. One is just in time, which the question previously that John, you asked, is not as important as some of the other elements. And then circular economy, which is more of the environmentally friendly production systems, processes, returns and all, is lower right now, but we're seeing pretty much a daily shift in that overall. But I think the key drivers are automation, kind of workforce habits, and then flexibility and remote working as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I would ask our partners here, let's go ahead and wrap up and kind of summarize with key takeaways for the audience. And I'll start with you, Anil.
Yeah, and I'll start with the comment on the left here, disruption of accelerated deferred maintenance. I mean, that actually has several elements in there, but fundamental in there is that the value of uptime, the value of automation, the value of capacity went up in the last couple of years. And so many companies that are actually for delaying investments in some of those areas are now moving those timelines up because they want to see their factories come up to full speed as they ramp up, and also ensure resilience and hence maximize their market delivery capacity.
Sherry, for me, the key takeaway is the traditional operating models that were built, years ago, most of the time are not fit for purpose anymore, either because the economic value equation has changed, or we're dealing with new revenue offerings, more services, less products, more digitally enabled offerings that are priced, differently. We're seeing changes in operating footprint. We're seeing changes in the way supply chain engages with, suppliers. These kinds of things all cause us to rethink operating models, transaction flows, entity structures, transfer pricing, attribute planning. So there's a lot of activity in that space.
Great. And John, what about strategic tax objectives?
Yeah, maybe two quick things. One, first, to build on Alex's comment, I think, some of these trends that we've talked about really do provide opportunities, for companies to sort of revisit their models. And this time of disruption is sort of unique in terms of an opportunity to focus on that, particularly given some of the tax changes. But I also think that there's we haven't spent a lot of time on it. We made reference earlier to the ESG, but this notion of, stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism, we're also seeing starting to creep into some of these decisions. And this notion that, it's not always about, the lowest cost way to deliver a product that drives decisions. Certainly it's important, but not always the number one factor. So that's maybe something to highlight.
Great. And, that just brings us back to kind of our key theme for the day, which is just the need for integrated business and tax, decision-making and cooperation, and that's, as high as it's ever been in these circumstances. And as everyone on this call knows, with tax backgrounds, that also requires multiple subspecialties within tax, in order to be effective. So with that, we're right on time. Thank you guys. Great discussion today. And thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.